Like most artists, when I've finished a drawing or a painting, I like to have a look at it and reflect on how well it went. If you're like me, one of the first questions you'll probably ask is, why does this piece of rubbish look nothing like the masterpiece that I had in my head when I started? But I like to try and move on to more constructive questions, like, what do I like about this? What would I do differently going forward? And possibly most importantly, what did I learn from doing this? Recently I've been doing quite a lot of life drawing just for practice, using Zoom sessions and doing some figurative work. And it's very useful to look at the sketches when they're finished. One of the things that I found increasingly helpful as I go forward is looking at the time-lapse recording of the work that I did. It's obviously very interesting looking at other people's time-lapse videos, but I think it's extremely helpful to be able to look at your own work and analyse it and see what you could potentially do differently. Most modern digital painting software has features to be able to record time lapses, so it's extremely easy now to be able to do this kind of work and then look at the recording afterwards. When I was looking at some of my material recently, I found it really interesting looking at the way that I was starting some of the drawings. I was actually looking at the playback and thinking, how did I actually do that? Why did I actually make those marks the way that I did, and why did I start the drawing the way that I did? Recently I heard a quote that was, I believe, attributed to the late Kim Young-ji, and it was, I wish you could see the lines that I can see, the lines that were in his head, not on the paper. And the more that I looked at my time-lapse recordings, the more I realised that that was actually what was at the heart of that question. How am I doing this? Why am I doing this? And I realised that my drawing style has actually moved on and become more intuitive. And some of the basics and the fundamentals, I'm now doing these quite differently, which was really interesting to me. So the more that I looked at it and the more that I thought about it, I thought this would make a good video to just go back to some of those basics, some of those fundamentals, and think about how I'm approaching things and whether I've actually maybe forgotten some of the things that were actually really helpful to begin with. So in this video, I'm going to talk a little bit about something called bounding box and envelopes, very basic fundamental drawing techniques. It's something that I certainly hear people talking about envelopes quite a lot, but bounding box as a concept isn't something that tends to get taught. So I thought this was maybe an opportunity to talk a little bit more about that, my method, how that's developed over the time, and just share some of the thinking behind why that's useful. So let's have a look. My name's Pete. Welcome to Basement Picasso. So before we get into the demonstration, I think it's useful to have a look at somebody that I think was an absolute master of observational construction and the ability to use and refine measurements in a way that were really reflected in the final image, and that's Euan Uglow. I had an opportunity to go down and see the Euan Uglow retrospective in the early 2000s, just after he had passed away, and seeing these drawings and paintings in real life, you really get to see how meticulous his observation and measurements were, And I think what's particularly precious about the drawings and paintings that he did is he lets you into that process, because all these marks and measurements come through in the final work. There's little clues about what he was looking at and what he was interested in, what he was measuring, and the preciseness and the time that he took to really look and measure is really quite exceptional. It took him a long time to do these paintings. And you can see in the image the marks right from some of the initial kind of pencil lines setting out initial constructs, through the constant use of little registration marks, little lines, little points, looking at where things were, where there was a corner, an edge, where a shape finished, and adjusting it as he went on. So nothing was ever put down and then just assumed that was it. It was perfectly right. It was just a constant process, and you can see the evolution in some of the edge work here, where the shape has been gradually refined over a period of time and things moved around. So it's a constant exploration to try and find things within the image. And most of his work, you will see this marking and measuring is completely prominent in the final image. It's not painted out, it's not turned into something that's a finished rendered image. It just gives you this amazing ability to see the process and see the thinking that was done as these images were constructed. And more complex images like this start to show not just that kind of measuring and the placement of points, but we can actually see the sort of gridding, the measuring, the horizontals and verticals, but then how that translates into these just incredibly well observed edges and the contours and shapes that are then found, the meticulous attention to detail for the angles that certain lines fall at, and just the very occasional use of simplification to identify where things can just be straightened very slightly to exaggerate and give that crispness to the observation that he's seeing. And you can see this right across the whole image, just even out in the outer corners, the little dots and measurements just everywhere as he goes through this painting. The observation is just constant throughout the process. I think this is one of the clearest examples, and what you'll see that in amongst all these little marks that just depict the corners of the shapes, the points of the shapes, all these sorts of things, what you'll notice is there's a little mark here and a little mark here, and these, for me, if you extend those out, start to become the bounding box of that shape of the pear. So his process is there, and is a step beyond what we'll start to talk about in terms of the bounding box. But this to me is what measuring and observation brought together can really give you. And I think to have drawings and paintings like this where they've been left showing you the history of that process, for me is actually a real privilege to be able to see that. And as I say, when I saw them in real life, even on the drawings, the tiny little points that he puts down almost become a bit of a join the dots, but every one of those points was just so carefully and precisely measured to begin with. So the way that I think about learning and teaching art is in these sort of three levels. So at the bottom we've got the good old fundamentals, things like line, edge, tone, shape, form, colour, composition and perspective, all the basics that you need to learn. And what helps you through that process is having somebody that's a good teacher, access to good materials online and all that sort of thing. In the middle level, I think of it in terms of execution. So the ability to have an idea and to be able to construct and finish a drawing or a painting, and all the things that go into that in terms of your style and technique and visual language, and the things like anatomy, the medium and the tools that you're using. And once you get to that level, what tends to help support your progress is more of a coach rather than a teacher. And then at the top level, you have the things that start to become increasingly subjective. So I refer to this as the expression. And this is things like the concept, the narrative or story, the emotion and the mood, the subject matter that you're depicting, and the motivation in terms of why you're creating that image and what you want to do with art more generally. And what helps you in that space is somebody that's really acting as a mentor. So what we're going to be looking at today is very much down in the fundamentals layer, and it's going to build on this concept of method. So the way that I think about method is in two halves. So there's the imaginative branch and the observational branch. So imaginative is very much in the space of illustrators, comic artists, concept artists, people that can construct images from their imagination to produce something that has effectively never existed before. They may well still use lots of reference material and things that feed into that, but ultimately the image that you're left with is something that essentially has never existed before. On the other half, we have observational. So this is really the realm of still life, landscape, portraiture, and this is where you're working either directly from the subject or from a reference that you've taken in terms of a reference photo. And the general intention of that observational work is that you're ultimately trying to largely recreate the scene, the person, the image that exists in front of you. You may still edit it, you may make lots of artistic adjustments, but ultimately you're trying to look at something and directly depict it within the image that you're trying to create. On the imaginative side, this takes you very much into the constructive space. There's lots of very good material out there. People like Bridgman have exceptional material to help artists construct anatomy from their imagination to be able to understand how to create something from scratch. On the observational side, what we have are two systems, the sight size method and the proportional method. So the sight size method is very good in terms of being very clinical, very focused on the detail and the accurate representation of the subject, whether it's a still life, a portrait, but the limitations with it are really around the sizing. So in general, the size of your work corresponds directly to the size of the subject. It's a one-to-one representation. So it's a very powerful drawing method to learn to be able to develop finesse in terms of your ability to see things, to represent light and shade, and to be able to produce something very academic, very realistic, very accurate. It is probably the single most effective mechanism to be able to learn that level of precision in your drawing and rendering. The proportional mechanisms, they allow a bit more flexibility, so you can scale your image up and down. You can draw something at a much larger scale, you can draw something at a much smaller scale, and that's what we're going to be looking at today. And there's a number of mechanisms that have historically been used to help support those kind of proportional mechanisms. So things like measuring, gridding, tracing. You can draw intuitively without necessarily being constructive. You can still just be responsive to what it is you're actually looking at. And you can use methods like enveloping, which is part of what we'll touch on today. The mechanism that I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about is starting off with something called the bounding box. And it's something that works in a combination of giving you some of the benefits of measuring, gridding, and then supporting the development of an envelope as you refine the image, but without having to be as precise and formulaic when you start, so you don't need to grid out your paper in advance. But you do get a lot of the benefits of this. So your first question is probably what exactly is a bounding box? And the definition of the bounding box that I use is it's the smallest box, and that can be a square or a rectangle, that you can draw where no part of the shape is outside the box. So you can see in the little illustration we have here on the left hand side we've got something that would not qualify as a bounding box, because on the left hand side some of the shape exists outside, so therefore that doesn't qualify. And also the box could be smaller, so it's not the smallest box that we could possibly draw. The shape on the right hand side shows us how we would draw a bounding box. So we have a box, in this case it's rectangular and it's horizontal, so it's longer horizontally than it is vertically, but we have a box. That box cannot get any smaller without part of the shape then becoming outside the box, and equally it's not possible to make that box any smaller. So that is the bounding box for that shape. And you'll notice we refer to shape, not object. When you start this, you may find that you gravitate towards drawing objects, and you'll see that in the demonstration that we're going to look at. But as you develop this, you'll start to quickly understand that what we're working with is actually the shapes that constitute the object, the light, the shadow, the negative shapes, and all these sorts of things. So the bounding box is not it's not an object-based mechanism, it's a shape-based mechanism, and we'll look to develop that. So let's have a look at doing some bounding box in practice. So I've got a reference image here. These little still life references are available on the website if you want to have a look. And what we'll do is, first of all, I'll just drop the opacity on that so it's not standing out quite so strongly. So the first thing we're going to do is do a bounding box, and typically you would pick the sort of strongest, most dominant thing in the image, possibly the focal point, or something that you just want to be able to focus on. So in this case, I think we'll go for the apple. And the principles of the bounding box are very, very simple. So as we said, the definition is the smallest box that we can draw where no part of the shape is outside that box. So the way that we do that is to think of it logically in terms of, if you imagine a ruler, we just bring that down until it just touches against the shape. So in this case, we're doing the object, we're doing the apple as a whole. In this case, the stalk of the apple is small enough that it's actually inside. If you had something where the stalk of the apple is sitting outside, then what I would generally recommend is little details get ignored at this stage. You're looking for the big shape. That's what you're interested in. So we draw that down and we can find the point at where that touches, and then we can just draw an edge. And the best thing to do is to draw the edge significantly bigger than it needs to be, so that you've simply got that line. So that line is as close as it can get to the object. It can't come any closer because the object would then be outside the box, and that's our first line. And then we'll do exactly the same coming up from the bottom. So we'll find the point at where it just touches, which is about there, and then again we'll draw the edge of the box. So that gives us the first two, and then we would just make our ruler vertical, and then we'll come in from the side until we find that it is just touching against the shape, and then again we'll draw that, and again we'll make it much bigger than it needs to be, and then we'll come in from the other side and we'll find where that point is, and we can then draw that line. Again, we'll just take that down. So that shape there is our bounding box, and that is now a construct that we know our object or shape sits fully within that. Now, when you're doing this, typically you would be using the standard sort of measuring, holding your thumb up, doing the old how, is it bigger, is it wider, what's the proportions? So ultimately that's how you would work out the relative measurements. And in this case, what we can see, in fact we can actually just literally measure it with this ruler, is that's just over 4 and a bit wide, and it is under 4 across. So we can see that visually, that it is slightly taller than it is wide, so it's not a perfect square. And therefore we've got the general proportions that this apple is not a circle, it's slightly askew, and the shape is very slightly taller than it is wide. So that gives us the general proportions. And when you're doing this, when you're measuring and you're putting your sort of finger up and so on, and measuring the angles and that sort of stuff, your initial bounding box in that sense is going to be approximate. If you're drawing from a reference photo like this, your bounding box can be absolutely specific. But if you're drawing from real life, then you need to remember that you will have approximations, and any errors and mistakes that you make in that will potentially start to get amplified out as you go forward. So you must treat this as an approximation, and you will always be refining and improving the drawing as you go forward. Now, because we're doing this digitally, what we can do is we can just duplicate that layer, and then I can move that layer across. So this is obviously what we would be doing if we were drawing from life, that we would now have our bounding box on the paper. So the next stage would be to start to refine this shape. Obviously our apple isn't a box, but before we go in and try and draw the perfect outline and contour of the apple, what we want to do is go through a stage which is generally called creating an envelope. So it's an approximation. And the way that we go about that, so first of all, what we'll do is just lower the opacity of these so we can see the new lines. And what we will do is to look at how we can approximate this shape. So on the left hand side here, we've got a small straight segment. Then we can draw a straight segment there and a straight segment there. It's a little bit that follows along the edge. Then we've got a straight segment, bring that down, and then we've got a straight segment, and we've got a couple of pieces here. And again, we can approximate with another couple of straight lines like that. And what you might start to notice is these little points where I'm kind of cutting in against the line and finding where points meet, then those are starting to look very much like Euan Uglow's little points in space, and identifying those marks that are relevant to help draw the shape. Again, if we duplicate that layer and then just move that across, what you'll see now is that we're now starting to get a much more refined approximation of that apple shape on the left hand side. Now, you can obviously do this in a sort of tracing mechanism like this, but if you're drawing from life or observation, then you are doing this by sight and by measuring and slowly taking your time to work out where these points are, where the line segments are, and starting to draw in and approximate each of those angles and shapes. So you would be noticing that the bottom section of this apple is more over to the left of that line segment, and the top section of that apple is from the middle to the right, and therefore the apple is slightly askew in terms of the overall shape. And you can see that if we hide those, then you can see that that apple, it's not a perfect circle, there's a skew, and that skew is actually sitting at an angle. So that shape, so what we've now got on the right hand side is the original first pass, which was the bounding box that gives us this construct within which we can start to work on the shape. And we've now started to work on that refinement. And again, going back to some of Uglow's drawings, you can see that detection of the angle and being very clinical and specific about the angles that were being looked at. So again, if we take that and then knock the opacity of that down a little bit, what we can now do is go into the third stage. So I'll just bring up another new layer on top of that. And this is when you would now start to be into your observational phase, where you're really now starting to think about line quality, line weight, and starting to refine that shape to really get the qualities that you're looking for. And you can obviously do this as much as you want, take as much time to get that contour as accurate and refined as you want, so that what you then end up with is your shape. And depending on what level of detail you want to go to when you're actually painting, you may find that even just that second level of refinement, the envelope that you're constructing, is enough to give you the level of information you need when you're painting, because your paint's going to be bigger marks, you're going to have brush strokes, and if you want that sort of looseness, then having that simplified shapes with those straight edges can give you a much nicer finish when it comes to actually doing your painting and making those marks. So you sometimes don't even need to take it down to that next level of finish. But obviously if you're working on something that's much more detailed, and if you're doing figurative stuff, and you've got faces and eyes and hands and fingers, then you'll find that you need to do several orders of magnitude of refining beyond that. Okay, so that's the 3 basic stages. We've got the bounding box, we've got the envelope to refine that, and then we've got the contour that we can refine further. That gives us our first core shape, or in this case core object, and what we can now do is look to expand that out across the rest of the drawing. So if we have a look at this orange segment here, and first of all, from a composition point of view, this is probably something I wouldn't actually be happy with, because the apple and these 2 orange segments are very much just in a vertical line, and artistically I don't think that's a good arrangement. And in fact, from the bounding box, we can see that it is actually a tangential. So what that means is we've got 2 things that are coming together along a single line. And that can sometimes be uncomfortable in terms of drawing, and one of the things that you want to adjust. But for just now, let's just leave that segment where it is and just work on how we would now incorporate that into the drawing. So what we're going to do is another bounding box, this time just for this orange segment. So if we go back to the original bounding box here, and we'll bring back the ruler. So same principle again, we're working on this orange segment. So what we're looking at is finding that top point and then drawing that line out. And in this case, I'll just take that over into the other side, which you'll see in a second. And then we come up to the bottom, find that bottom point, and then that's going to be the bounding box there. I'll take that across, and then we'll do the verticals. Just make sure my ruler is nice and straight. So we've already got 1. So what we'll do is actually just extend that a little bit, and then we can see when we come in from the other side, then we've got the point just there. So we can see in the bounding box, what we can see visually, that this orange segment is not as wide as the apple. So that edge is to the right of the edge of the apple. So we've got a relative measurement there. So that's now the bounding box construct of those 2 objects together. So if we go back to the bounding box that we had for the other drawing, then what we know is that that gives us the extension to that edge, because that is actually lining up perfectly with this edge. But what we need is to bring this in so it's not as close to that edge. So by visual measurement, then we need to bring that in so that bounding box is a bit smaller. So that's us now got the bounding box for those 2 shapes. And what that then means is we can bring in the way that we did the refinement on the first shape. If we go to, let's just knock that down a bit as well.
Okay, so let's just get rid of the ruler so we're not drawing straight lines. And again, what we now want to do is approximate that shape. So the same principle as before, we're finding points where the shape touches against the bounding box, and then we've got the approximation of the angles that we can then draw in. So approximate that. Got a little piece there. And we can approximate that. And that one. This time I'm just going to take those lines out just a bit further just so you can see what that approximation is really doing. And this can actually be something that you can use in your drawing, is extending these approximation lines, the sort of rough blocking. And these lines can actually become interesting across the drawing in their own right. And it's a way of actually fracturing the space around it in a way that's coherent with the actual objects that you're looking at and drawing. So that gives us that rough enveloping, and that's how we would approach it on that, and then we would do the same on the drawing. So if we were drawing from life, obviously we wouldn't be tracing over it like that, so we'd be working out the same sort of principle in terms of where those points are in space, using the sort of relative positions. Is it above the halfway point? Just making visual references in terms of where the halfway point is, and then we've got two marks either side of that. And then we're looking, so we'd be actually measuring the angles, sort of visually in terms of, what's the angle that line's going at. Drawing in those approximations. So that we end up with something like that. So that then gives us the rough feeling of that overall segment. And remember, like we said before, all of this is never fixed in stone. You can adjust it, erase it, move it around, and constantly rework it. These are only ever really just guidelines and constructions to help you start to place things. But hopefully what you can now see from that is if we take that layer, we're now in a position where we can go back up the lines. We can now start to look at what that shape is actually doing, and then draw in something that more accurately reflects the contour of that particular object. And again, you can spend as much time as you want on that, refining the edge, refining the line weight, the quality, and just spend as much time as you want to refine that. What we've now got are two shapes, in this case two objects, sitting relatively in space together. One of the advantages of this method is it will inherently deal with perspective without you ever needing to know or understand perspective. So if things are bigger, you will simply draw them bigger. By looking at the relative angles of everything, you will be drawing things in the correct perspective. So that's one of the inherent advantages of this in terms of being able to look at things and observe. So that's the principle for an outer shape, and we could continue that to get the bounding boxes of the other objects relative to that. So let's just do that. So we've got the bounding boxes finished. Yeah, and then if we just duplicate that and then move that across, and again just visually look to line that up and place it. So again, this is really ultimately what you're doing constantly, is visual alignment and placement. So once we OK that, so you can now see how we're starting to get at the bounding box level that kind of structure. And as you get further and further onto this, you'll find that you're not necessarily so much doing specific bounding boxes, but you may start to get bounding shapes that help you begin to place things. Let's see, I missed one there in terms of at that point there. But you can now start to see how as this structure and measuring mechanism comes up. If you think back to those Euan Uglow paintings, that just these marks that are observing and making these kind of relative measurements to get these points where you can then start to build out edges and shapes from it. That's ultimately what he was doing with that kind of structural system of measurement. So these lines effectively become your framework for the drawing. And we can finish that off in terms of doing the next level of refinement. So if we just drop the opacity down on that a bit, pop in a new layer, and this time I'm just going to really just do it visually in terms of just very roughly what that sort of refinement looks like. And again, the more lines you start to get on your structural drawing, the more relative comparisons you can make. So for example, there's a little straight segment here on this particular orange, and what I can see from that line, if we just bring that to vertical, if we bring that line down, then I can make comparisons to where is that line and then where are those points relative to that in terms of that little straight segment. And I can see it's to both the left and the right, but it's more to the right than it is to the left. So I can use that line as my first kind of measuring point, and then bring out slightly to the left and slightly more to the right, and get that as the segment, and then be able to put that approximation in. So the lines and the points and the references become more and more reinforcing in terms of the confidence that you have that things are sitting in the right sort of space, and that the adjustments you are making and the refinements you're doing to the drawing are simply getting more and more accurate as you go along. So at this point, I'm starting to almost get a sense of feeling like I'm swapping into a more intuitive mode, and that I'm just almost looking past the structural lines and just wanting to start to draw in the shapes, and that's very consistent with what I was starting to see when I was looking at my time-lapse recordings of what I'd been doing. Let's just do this last one just to finish it off so that we can see how this is working. Fortunately, my logo's sitting over that, but that's fine. I can just draw that in, and then that will give us a sense of that segment. So what we now have on the right hand side is a really good sort of coherent overall structure and placement, and then that first level refinement. So that's how you build out objects that are sitting across the space. What we'll now have a look at is the way that you can draw inner shapes within these. Okay, so let's have a look at how we can use what I would call inner bounding boxes, and that's a way to get shapes within shapes. So if we take this apple, for example, then there's a label there, and that would be an example of something that we could do a bounding box around. So just following the usual process, we can draw the edges to that, and then draw the edges. So that's the bounding box, and we can see it's slightly taller than it is wide. And again, what we've now got, as I said, we can build up more and more reference points. So what we can do is, if we extend those lines out, we can start to see where they interact with the existing bounding box that we already have. We can do that both horizontally and vertically, and that then gives us a reference for how to construct that particular bounding box. So if we come back to our drawing, we can start to see where these edges are. So this edge is very close to that flat edge at the top, so we've got a point there that we can sort of bring in, and then this point here is about midway between these two reference points there. So our shape's in there, and if we go into the horizontal, we can see that again we've got a sort of segment there, and it's sitting just below that. And then again we've got close to that kind of angle, it's just sitting just below that. It's about there. And I can see sort of visually looking at that, that's looking like it's too tall and thin compared to that. And what we can see is that the verticals are actually looking quite good. So it looks like I need to move one of those out a bit. Slightly wider like that. And then again, we would just be able to roughen the shape of that, and that then gives us the structure that we can then drop the opacity down on, and we could then do our final line work off the side of that. So what we've got is a label that's sitting in there, something like that. And we can also use this approach with the shadow shapes. So here there's 2 shadows on the apple. If we just go back and bring this opacity up first of all so it's clearer. So you can see that there's a cast shadow from the orange. The light's coming in from the left, gets blocked by the orange, and the orange is casting a shadow on that. And then that shadow falls into the form shadow, which is the shadow of the apple itself and the light and shadow of that. So we've got this shadow shape within the apple, which is this sort of little bit of a roller coaster, kind of curving down and then curving back up. So by this point we've got more than enough sort of reference points to be able to go back up and then start to effectively go straight to the sort of enveloping stage of that shadow. We can see it comes across and then it's just playing around the edge of that label, cutting up and then in like that. So that gives us an approximation of the shadow shape. And if we were taking this further and going into sort of tone work, then we would obviously be able to block that in as being the lane for the basic shadow for that shape. So that's ultimately how we would start to take this forward, and you'll eventually get to the point where you can just start to be a bit more intuitive in terms of some of the shapes that are in there, and just finish out the last couple of bits of the drawing. And then just build on it and refine it to whatever degree that you want. So that sort of principle, you can just keep going through the shapes. All these orange segments, they've all got inner shapes of the actual segment, and then the white and line down the middle, all these sorts of things. So each of these I wouldn't necessarily do bounding boxes around those. I would really just start to go to the approximation and start to find out roughly where they're sitting. I think we've got the shape there, and the more your drawing builds up, the easier this becomes, because all these kind of references are all being made relative to other things that you've got this sort of increasing confidence that they're sitting in the right space and the right sort of positions. So the proportions are reasonably correct, and you're not drawing things significantly out of proportion. So I'm going to leave it at that point. We could obviously carry on. We could do the various inner shapes and the shadows and take that drawing forward. But hopefully in terms of a process and understanding the method, the bounding boxes, the envelope approximations, the refining the contours, that 3-step process hopefully starts to make more sense. And then extending the bounding box to give you this, what's almost effectively a self-gridding structure. So without ever having to start off by having a precise grid, what you start to build up with is a grid of relevant lines that are helping you place things in the right position and helping you to constantly measure around the drawing. So going back to the time-lapse recording that I was looking at, and then looking at the finished drawing, comparing it to this reference. Now this reference wasn't from the actual Zoom session, it was just a setup pose, so the pose is slightly different. But on reflection, it's helpful to show me a couple of things in terms of how I actually go about drawing and why I'm making some of those marks. So having been through this, what I now realise is when I start drawing the head, what I'm really doing is going straight to stage 3 in terms of trying to go effectively straight to the kind of contour refinement stage. So instead of what I'm actually thinking about in my head is that there's a bounding box around the figure and the face. So I do the face, not the whole head, not the hair. I'm just looking at that as a shape. And then in my head, I'm doing that sort of refinement to give us the approximation of that as a shape. And then what I'm doing is going straight to effectively stage 3 and just trying to intuitively draw in those shapes and curves. And that's why I'm drawing those marks the way that I do. But what's interesting is when I look at something like the hand, what I'm actually doing is stage 2. So I'm effectively seeing these more as singular shapes and then looking at drawing the overall envelope of that as a shape. And you can see that on the left hand side in terms of the shape of the top of the hands and the general shape of the fingers, and then the general shape of the thumb in terms of whatever position it is. So it's really interesting to me that I'm sort of jumping around. I'm in these drawings because they're really quick. I'm very rarely actually doing stage 1 at the moment. Sometimes I default back to stage 2. Other times I'm trying to get straight to stage 3 and draw quickly and intuitively. And what I can see, although again these poses are slightly different angles, to me the overall head height here compared to the bounding box in the hand clearly makes the hand look big, and also the head, although the head's turned slightly more, I can see that the overall structure of the head doesn't look quite right in terms of the general proportions. So this whole process for me has been really helpful and instructive, thinking about what I'm doing, how I'm actually approaching it, and I think going forward what that's going to make me think about, even in these quicker drawings, is maybe just slowing down a little bit, thinking about these bounding constructs, the horizontals and the verticals that you start to get out of these shapes, and actually just being a bit more structural in terms of the drawing without trying to become really academic and methodical, because obviously you generally only have maybe 5, 10, 15 minutes to do these. But in terms of being able to improve the overall quality and accuracy of the drawing, I think that for me is going to be a helpful next step as I move forward with this.
So when I first came up with the idea for this video, I thought it was maybe going to be about 10 minutes long. I thought it would probably only take me a couple of hours to put together. It's already over an hour. It's taken me the best part of 2 days to edit it. So I don't know if my drawing skills are getting any better, but I certainly know my time estimation skills aren't, which is a bit disappointing. But how long things take is actually possibly one of the lessons from this, because a lot of people might think this is a very slow, methodical way to draw. It's going to take a long time. It's only really applicable if you're doing one of these 5-day drawings, or you're going to spend a month on a single drawing. Then it's worth taking the time to do this. But in many ways, the opposite's potentially true. If a drawing goes wrong really quickly, then you'll spend an awful long time trying to get it back again. If at all, you might end up actually abandoning it. Whereas if you spend a little bit more time at the start getting the structure in place, and then getting increasingly confident as you go forward that you're building on a good foundation, that you're able to become looser and more intuitive within a framework that is going to work, you've got a better long-term chance of getting that drawing to work effectively. So for me, what I've taken out of this is there's an element of slowing down to speed up, taking a step back to take 2 steps forward. And this is very much something that I'm going to try and incorporate in what I'm doing over the coming weeks and months to help to continue to develop. So if you've made it this far, a huge thank you for watching. I hope it's been interesting and helpful. If you'd like to see more of these sorts of things, please let me know. Feel free to leave some comments, subscribe to the channel, that would be really good. Leave the video a like. I'll put some links in the descriptions below to the reference images and to some of the other videos and books that I've mentioned. If you've got any other thoughts, please do let me know. Otherwise, huge thank you for spending some time, and hope to see you again soon.